All right. Welcome, everyone. Please see everyone back. Please be seated. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Program Teacher Certification class. All right. Hope everyone's having a great week so far and been able to put into practice the things that we've been going over the previous days, really the previous weeks, in the third unit of the intermediate series, which is the self-control unit. And we are continuing in chapter 2 this evening for your notes. Again, we do remind you, if you are watching, and I know a lot of you have heard this many times before, but we do have a lot of people every class that find us and start to watch these classes and see the benefits of them. You can go to the little drop-down menu on the official Peaceful Solution page of the Facebook, and there you can pull down the menu, which will give you the option. You select more for the books that we have and are covering right now. So far, we've gone through character, acceptance, and this is the third unit, self-control. So if you do that, then you're able to follow along with us in this class. And of course, you can go back and watch the previous classes, which we do encourage you to do so, because all of the information that we're covering this evening has been a constant build-up, as building blocks are, the foundation being laid, and then the walls and the roof and the plumbing and the electrical and so forth, before we have this whole structure of a house in place. And what we're talking about here, of course, is not necessarily building a house, but building our character. And in order to do so, there has to be a changing of the hearts and minds, because either way, or whatever environment that someone comes up in, irregardless of whether they're proactively or deliberately taught, they're going to learn things, right? That environment, the genetics, the family values, the experiences, the influence, and so forth, they're all contributing factors to what a person learns, to what a person values, and of course, to what a person becomes. And what a person becomes is measured by their behavior. Okay, this is how a person, a teacher, is able to look at a student and kind of gauge to some degree. Of course, the teacher themselves, they have to be educated and understand the standard that differentiates positive from negative, but it is through that they can look at the student and see, if they have mostly a positive character, possibly mostly a negative character. Remember, there's nobody is 100% all-time always positive. There's a combination, or there's a combination of both things, right, in us, the positive and the negative characteristics. And of course, the purpose of this program is to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. But we've got to know both sides of the coin so that we know what we're working with. And this is what we get. And like I said, this whole foundation being laid from the very first unit here in the intermediate series, understanding what character is, the difference between character and personality, how it's developed, how it can be maintained, and how it can be displayed to others or seen in others as well. Okay, so we're continuing in chapter 2 here of the self-control unit, and we're going to be picking up on page 41. Now, remember what we were talking about in the previous few pages, because this chapter here specifically deals with emotions, right? Using self-control in controlling your emotions, or as the title of it is, controlling your emotions to your advantage. In other words, so that you can obtain the best outcome in life that you can obtain, that you can qualify for, right? We can qualify for many things, just like degrees or levels of honor or positions within a company. You can qualify for those things. The more educated and the more experienced you are, the greater your qualifications are, and the more you can get. Well, in regards to success in life, it's no different. You have to be educated, and those experiences, in other words, putting into action the lessons that you've learned in different circumstances, right? To determine, well, if I steal, this is what the consequence is, or if I choose not to steal, this is the reward, or I had the opportunity to be irresponsible, but I chose to be responsible, and I saw what was the outcome for that, right? So, all these experiences build up to make our character. And of course, there is a great advantage to developing and practicing positive morals, okay? In life. In fact, that's what everybody in life, for the most part, generally speaking, that's what most people, companies, institutions, the public, in regards to their political leaders, their public officials, law enforcement, that's what they want to see displayed, right? They want to see these positive character traits that we've been covering for the last several years here. They want to see these positive character traits displayed in their interactions with them. Now we've got to get everybody on the same boat here, so that it's a reciprocal thing. Understanding that even though we want those characteristics displayed towards us, it's just as important that we display those characteristics towards others as well. And so this is why it's important, because like we've mentioned in the previous classes, in the age group of 11 through 13, as teachers and learning and understanding these things, each and every one of us who is past that age anyway, we can empathize, right? We can understand what has gone through the minds of a young man or a young woman who is going through that time period of their life, right? We know we've gone through puberty, we've gone through the emotions, we've gone through the insecurities, or the wanting to be accepted, or to trying to strike out on our own, to show that we're old enough to do things, from our outside of our parents, our house, and so forth. So we should be able to some degree empathize and relate with our students in knowing the challenges that they face in their life, and even more so now than when many of us grew up in the 50s through 70s, 50s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. There's a lot more challenges and distractions and influences and so forth that many of the young women and men and women have to face today, right? And it's a challenge to grasp their attention and hold it, to get them to understand the importance of developing a positive character. And well, that comes with some teacher training skills, right? Using some honey, to grab the attention, the sweetness of the honey, to grab the attention of the student's mind and get them to listen, to accept, and then apply the lessons that are being presented here. Well, if we look at Lesson Plan 2, page D, or LP2D, we'll go back there. We'll go back to these procedures here, because we completed procedure number 4 last class when we finished that last page that I covered, which was page 40. And we're going to be picking up on procedure number 5 today. And it says here, tell students that the key to practicing self-control is the way we respond. And that is very, very, very important, right? Because, people don't realize that there is a response given in pretty much any situation. Even if a person asks you something and you don't say anything, that not saying anything is a response. That response is you choosing to be silent, right? You're choosing to not say something just as well as you would choose to say something, whether it's in respect or disrespect. And I wanted to look at that there, that first sentence there. Tell students that the key to practicing, because William made a great point in the class that he presented a couple of weeks ago, in making mention as a reminder to the teachers, us as teachers, that when we see words, we shouldn't just gloss over them, because they're an essential part of us doing our jobs when we read over these procedures, the lesson plans. And then also when we go through the lessons and certain things are pointed out to the students, we can't expect a student to understand or assume that they understand every definition of a word. And it says, tell students that the key to practicing self-control is in the way we respond. And in that word there, key, it means of paramount or crucial importance. Of paramount or crucial importance, And it made me think of something, because when we think about building and building a positive character, it made me think about the word, and I'm sure some of you have heard this if you've seen buildings or know anything about buildings or architecture. It made me think about the word keystone, right? Because this practicing self-control, all right? So it's very important. You go to a house, you want to get in, can't open the door without the key legally, right? Some people use brick keys, but those don't hang very well on keychains. If you go to a car, you've got to have the key to get in it, right? And even in dealing with the business world and so forth, and in a lot of the lessons that we've covered, you'll see phrases like the key to success. Okay, so in other words, there is something that is inaccessible, but is accessible if you have the right tool to get to it, right? Kind of like a combination of knowledge and tools, right? And then you have the keys to success that you need in order to build a particular thing or find a particular treasure or whatever it is that you might be striving to accomplish. But it's of paramount or crucial importance. And then I was thinking about that keystone because, I don't know, for me, it blew my mind when I heard about keystone. I just thought it was a frosty beverage that you have on a hot day, But later on in life, I realized that this was actually something, right? This was actually something. In fact, Abilene, I believe, is called a key city. They call it a key city, okay? And looking up this definition of this word keystone, it is a keystone or a capstone. It's also called a capstone. It is the wedge-shaped stone at the apex, which apex is pretty much at the very top. You've heard of statements of apex predators, the top predators, basically top of the food chain. At the apex of a masonry arch, or typically round-shaped one at the apex of a vault. In both cases, notice though, it is the final piece placed during construction, and it locks all the stones into position, allowing the arch or vault to bear weight. And so for a illustration there, I got that there, a picture of a keystone there, and you can see that in regards to what they're referring to, this here part is the keystone. And so you have all these stones that come together right here, and the keystone is what holds it all together, and it bears the weight or the burden of that arch. Well, think about what we're talking about here, that the key in practicing, now it's not keystone, but it made me think about that. Practicing self-control is the way we respond. Well, here's self-control here, and here's what we're trying to achieve in life. Success, right? Like we covered in the previous procedure, having a healthy life physically and mentally. Well, part of it is in how we respond with morality, right? That ties it all together, that connects it all together. And with that, we're also able to bear the difficulties in life. We're able to bear the test, the trials, the curveballs, the pitfalls, the setbacks, the disrespect that we're guaranteed to be shown occasionally from people who have not been taught and are not learning how to develop a positive character. So, like I said, before, everything that we're learning is very, very essential to us truly developing a positive character. We can't leave anything out with these lessons. That's why we encourage you, when you're not sitting in the class, to go back and watch the previous lessons and to follow along in the workbook, the teacher's manual. And so, see, we have here the key to practicing self-control is in the way we respond, and that's what we're going to be covering today, the respond, how to respond in governing our emotions, okay? And spoiler alert, we have an acronym for that later on, but that's several chapters down the road there in regards to response. And then it says, instruct students to turn to page 41, because that's where we're going to be starting this evening, and read the section entitled, It's All in the Way You Respond. Have students read the section entitled also Impulsive Reactions. Now notice here, impulsive reactions. So now what we're covering is it's all in the way you respond, and also impulsive reactions. they can lead to irrational behavior, and that's found on page 42. And then it says, have students read both the scenario and the article, and complete the corresponding questions. Discuss how impulsive behavior can lead to serious consequences. And we talked about those consequences and what they bring in a person's life, as well as how a person, by focusing on and harboring negative emotions can actually bring physical, mental, and emotional consequences to themselves and others. Stress the importance of practicing self-control so that they can respond appropriately in any given situation. And of course, that's the goal, that's the key in training our students. We want them to be able to respond appropriately in any given situation. And we want them to be able to remember these things, right? Realistically, they're not going to be walking around, carrying their book underneath their arm everywhere they go, right? But if they learn these things and practice these things and rehearse these things over and over, it's going to be in the forefront of their mind, right? Or at the very least, they're going to know where to find them. All right, so let's look over to page 41. Okay, page 41, and we're going to start here in this title, or this section entitled, It's All in the Way You Respond. And it says here, it doesn't matter if your emotions are positive, negative, or mixed. Because remember, we talked about that on page 40, how emotions can be really confusing. They can be really confusing to a person who especially doesn't even understand the emotions that they might be encountering. It's called mixed emotions, right? What matters is how you respond to all of these emotions. Keep in mind that emotions strongly influence how we conduct ourselves. They are a strong influence. And remember what we covered about influences. Anything that has the ability to affect the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we act, right? And that thought process is the very thing that we want to get our students to recognize immediately, right? And because it's like one of the first things that's overlooked. They overlook the thought that led to the emotion, and they focus on the emotion and how to deal with that emotion. I'm angry. Remember, we covered anger is a secondary emotion. It's not a primary emotion. But even if they're dealing with the primary emotion, I'm embarrassed, right? How are they going to respond? What was the thought that led to that embarrassment and led to the emotion? Okay, because the goal is not to focus on the emotion, but the thoughts that led to it, and changing the thoughts to change the emotions and to focus on bringing forth a positive response, a peaceful solution. So they strongly influence how we conduct ourselves. Now, although emotions can occur almost instantaneously, you have the ability to consider how you should respond to what you feel before you take action. And of course, we've come this far now in these courses, but a person wouldn't even understand the fact that in order for them to have the ability, they have to be educated. They have to be trained. They have to be taught, right? And not just taught once or twice. It's a continuous process of teaching. And then they have to be given the time and the space to see how to apply those lessons into their lives in different scenarios and real life scenarios and circumstances that they might encounter, right? Because it's one thing to be taught something in the classroom. It's another thing when you experience what that lesson presented, and now you have the opportunity to put it into practice. And then you can see, okay, okay, I see how to use this right here. And I see, okay, yeah, it did bring about this result, or I see where I should have practiced what I learned to bring about a result and have a better response, okay? So in order for them to have the ability, of course, they have to have the knowledge. I wanted to go back there because we cover that over and over and over and over again in the acceptance unit on how knowledge is power. I want to just read back in the acceptance unit on page 11, under that title there, it says, taking your education seriously is another way you can demonstrate that you are a unique individual with potential. And remember that potential means you have you have the ability or the power to accomplish something, right? We gave the example of the amount of potential that is in an electrical circuit, right? Once the switch is closed, then you can realize the potential of that electricity, okay? Because it's there, but something has to occur in order for that electricity to get from point A to the load or to the light or to the motor or whatever it is. Well, it's the same thing with us in building a positive character. We have the electricity as kind of like the knowledge, and the switch is us putting it into practice, right? When the switch closes and we put that knowledge into practice, then we can realize the rewards, experience the rewards or the benefits of practicing positive character traits, okay? And so it's like the light, so to speak, when you're in a dark area and your pupils are stretched to their max because they're trying to absorb as much light as they possibly can, and you're able to finally, find the light switch and flip it on, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and relax because now you can see your environment. And now you're better able to make decisions. You're better able to navigate in the room or the area that you're in. You can see the hazards and the pitfalls and so forth. And this is what knowledge does for us. It enlightens us, right? It gives us understanding so that we can see dangerous things. We can see bad scenarios. We can see negative influences, and we can see when someone's trying to encourage us or influence us to do something that could bring harm, and we can make rational choices, sensible choices, like we're going to be talking about here a little bit later in this lesson. But it continues here. It says, you have a responsibility to continuously pursue positive morals, positive moral ways to improve yourself. Getting a sound education is one way in which you can do this. In addition to your basic subjects, English, social studies, mathematics, and science, a sound moral education will assist you in being aware of what's going on in your community, nation, and world. And we talked about some of these things in the character unit and in the acceptance unit, because there are a lot of things that go on, not just like necessarily things you find in the news, but there's a lot that goes on every day in society, globally and locally and so forth. And a lot of those things can play a huge influence on who you become, the things you value, the things that you strive to attain in life, what you measure as success and so forth. So it's necessary for people to be aware of those things so they can make better choices, because some of those things might not always be positive. Well-informed people are knowledgeable about the world around them. They pay attention to influences. Notice there, influences around them. They gather all the facts, then test and prove what is correct before making a decision. Now, the thing about testing, right, when you test anything, a person, an element, a metal, a product, you have to have a standard by which you measure it, right? When you test, like, in other words, everybody in here has been to school and you've had to take a test, right? And, one of the things people, at least in high school, I don't know how much people were striving to in junior high and elementary, but in college too, one of the things that the not so honest crowd wanted to do was they wanted to get the teacher's test key. If they could somehow steal it or take a picture of it or copy it or something like that, then they would have the key to passing the test. But that test key was the standard by which all the other tests were graded. Okay, so this is the thing that we have to take into consideration, is that getting the facts and then proving what is correct before making a decision, we have to compare it to a standard. And that standard has to be something that helps us to distinguish between what's right and wrong. And that's, of course, what we're giving our students. We're giving our students a standard by which they can compare other things to determine if those things are right and wrong, if they're beneficial, if they're harmful, right? If they can cause them to have setbacks in life, or possibly even cause them to accelerate in certain things in life. Continuing here on, this is page 11 of the acceptance unit. It says there, ironically, many teens report that youths that are smart or picked on are smart, who are smart. Okay, we don't need to read that. That's just talking about, let's look at the last sentence. That's what I wanted. It says, people who are informed and determined to maintain a positive moral character will not jeopardize their safety, health, or future. Okay, irregardless of what influences or peer pressure might be coming towards them, they won't do anything to jeopardize their health, safety, or future. And that ties in, a lot to what we're going to be talking about this evening, because we'll find in life, and many of us have experienced in life, that we sometimes can make decisions that are impulsive, irrational decisions. And then what do we have? We're left bearing the consequences of those decisions as a result. Okay, so it says here, although your emotions can occur almost instantaneously, you have the ability to consider. Now remember here, this word consider means to think carefully about something, typically before making a decision. You don't throw the baseball towards the house and then stop and consider, should I have thrown that baseball towards the house? The glass shatters in the background, or whatever. No, you think carefully about something before making that decision. And of course, that ties us back to, the STOP acronym, the stop and think, carefully think. And like we've mentioned in times past, sometimes it might take a little time. It might take a little effort. You might have to step back from the situation, especially when it's something that we might find ourselves, closely attached to, or some type of an emotional attachment to that particular thing. It might be necessary to step back and give ourselves a little bit of time, possibly consult with, a trusted adult or an individual who might not be connected to the matter, to get their input to help us to make a wise, sound, rational, and sensible decision. So it'll give you the ability to consider how you should respond to what you feel before you take action. Did you know that even positive emotions acted on without self-control could lead to regret? You think, well, positive emotions, well, how could you have regret from experiencing or putting forth the positive emotion? Well, let's look at the example that's given down here, continuing on page 41. For example, you are informed that you have won a drawing for a $100 gift certificate at the mall. Nowadays, that'll probably get you like a pair of socks, maybe 2 pairs of socks. $100 doesn't seem to get you very much anymore today, with everything increasing, price-wise. You become so excited, you begin to jump up and down, knocking your mother's expensive vase to the floor. You end up having to use your winnings to replace the vase you broke. You see, so even with that excitement there, not practicing self-control and considering your environment, the person in this example ended up breaking something, and they had to pay for it. So they kind of like, I guess you could say, they broke even. And in regards to that, I bet you that was a bittersweet experience, probably more a sweet bitter experience, because they're excited for winning the certificate, and then they realize they're going to have to spend that money to replace their mother's vase. Well, I would think that a person would, through that, understand that, I need to stop and not jump around before I stop and look around before I jump around with excitement in the future. And so that's an example of how experiencing positive emotions without, or acting on positive emotions without self-control can lead to regret. Now look down underneath the picture there. That's a picture of the young man knocking over the vase. It says, applying self-control to any emotion, whether it's fear, joy, excitement, or anger is an important aspect of developing character, of course, positive character, and it's a necessary aspect of developing positive character. It's something that we must use in every single situation, right? Because we can never, especially as we learn this information, these principles that are being presented in these books and these lessons, we can never use the excuse, and we should never be satisfied with the excuse, well, this person made me, right? This person made me. Because you hear this from young, you hear from adults too, but you hear from a lot of young people when something occurs and they're faced with the consequence, then that irresponsibility kicks in, that defense mechanism kicks in. Well, he or she made me, Well, later on it's, well, you can't make me do that. Can't make me do that. Clean your room. She thinks she's going to make me clean my room. I'll leave my clothes all over the place if I want to. Those back and forth emotions, those back and forth frames of thoughts and so forth. They want to be on their own and independent and adult-like, but then they want to put the blame on somebody else when they're facing the consequences. Well, we have to apply self-control to all emotions, right? And as we're going to continue to learn as we move forward here, might not consider it, but we have control. We play a part on whether we decide to display an emotion or not, right? Or act on an emotion, okay? Acting on emotions without careful consideration is called acting impulsively, and that's an important thing to kind of underline and understand in explaining this to your students. And we have the definition here in this paragraph. But acting impulsively leads to a lot of problems in life, right? And right here underneath this previous sentence, it says acting or impulsive actions occur when you allow, okay, see, so there's an element of not exercising control, okay? Either because you're so focused on the particular emotion or the situation or the person, right, that you're not thinking about the necessity to practice self-control, to bring yourself back, under subjection of moral principles and how to respond. People, they just take the emotion and they run with it. But impulsive actions occur when you allow emotions, notice here, to cloud your ability to think rationally, right? To be rational in your thinking. Then you think about that, when a person's mind is clouded, it's kind of like, I kind of like to compare it to a person who is, like intoxicated, maybe with alcohol or a drug or something like that. Their thought process is very clouded, and they're not able to make rational decisions. Even their motor functions are sometimes hindered. They go to put a spoon to their mouth and they hit their eye or something like that. Because the signals are not being relayed properly because there's something blocking it. Whether when it's alcohol and so forth. But it can also be emotions. Emotions can do the same thing. They cloud a person's ability to think rationally, to think a matter through, to think about the best outcome in that particular situation. And of course, it should be the peaceful outcome in any situation, the right choice, a choice that won't bring harm to us, the other person, or the environment, that won't damage possessions and property and so forth, as we're going to mention that before when we get into the next chapter and understanding about anger and anger styles. One of those styles of anger is displacement, and people will sometimes they'll act out their emotions on other people or other things, right? This person, they're upset because somebody said or did something to them, or they didn't say or do something to them. It could be either way. So they go and they kick the trash can, right? They show that trash can who's boss, because this person did something to me, right? And that's called displacement. And it's an anger style, but nonetheless, it is not taking into consideration that all things deserve to be shown respect, right? You're doing something that could possibly damage or destroy someone else's property or even your property, okay? So it's important that we think about those things because, first it might be a trash can, then it might be a wall. Next thing you know, it might be a person, right? Because it's not the thing that's the problem. It's the response of the individual to their emotion, okay? So, a wall, a person, or whatever, it won't stop. Eventually, they'll do something to hurt someone else or even themselves. Now, to be rational, because here's the definition of rational, because it says impulsive actions occur when you allow emotions to cloud your ability to think rationally. So to be rational means to think sensibly and wisely. To think sensibly and wisely. This word sensibly means chosen in accordance with wisdom or prudence, likely to be of benefit. Likely to be of benefit. All right, chosen in accordance with wisdom or prudence. And the word prudence or prudence just means, to be cautious. Someone who is cautious. A prudent person, they stop and they think. In other words, they stop and they think before they proceed. They're a rational person. A prudent person is a wise person. They are cautious about the decisions that they make and the actions that they display. So to be rational means to think sensibly and wisely, having gathered enough facts to make intelligent choices. All right. And so with what we're learning here in the Peaceful Solution, it's kind of like the blueprint, right? The blueprint that you need, that you have to follow in order to build the house. Well, let's just say every decision that you make, is a tiny house that you're building, okay? And you have to follow the blueprints or the rules, right, that enable you to finish that house exactly according to the pattern that showed. In other words, if you don't follow the blueprints, you're going to mess up the house, right? It's not going to have the outcome or the design that it was supposed to have. Your decisions aren't going to be successful if you don't follow these blueprints that we're covering here, and these moral principles, blueprints to help us to make positive choices, right? To develop and to maintain a positive character, right? And so if we were just remember these principles, they're kind of the blueprint or the code, so to speak, because when you're building a building, you've got to follow code. There's plumbing code, carpenter code, electrical code, fire code, and so forth. There's different building codes that have to be followed, and all of those things are for the safety of the occupants. It's for the stability, integrity of the building. So just some Joe Blow won't come and throw a building up and say, oh yeah, I know how to build. I've seen it on YouTube a time or two, right? They got their degree on YouTube. And next thing you know, the first wind or earthquake or, whatever, then the building comes crumbling down, causing structural damage to other places and possibly harm to life. So it's necessary that we understand the code or the rules, which we're learning here in morality, so that we can make intelligent choices. Well, you've got to know how to gather the facts, right? You've got to know, as we covered in the class, that there's some facts and then there's true facts. Anybody can post something online and say that this is a fact, and make it up. Everything online is not a fact. Everything in the book is not a fact. But we have to be able to understand and gather those things to be able to make intelligent choices and compare them with other resources and so forth. Now it says here, rational thinking, you see here what's first. It has to begin with the thoughts. And this is, again, something that you can't overestimate in the minds of your students. I really, would encourage you to stress to your students the great potential that they have in using this storehouse of knowledge here, their brain, their heart and their mind, and working together in making decisions, okay? And being able to think rationally. And notice what it does here. It leads to decisions that are well thought out. And you remember what those decisions do. In this case, where the goal is to lead to decisions that bring about rewards, right? That bring about success, that bring about positive outcomes in life. Because when we stop, we think, we consider our options, then of course we proceed with the decision, once we make one, thoughts lead to feelings, feelings lead to actions, right? Feelings lead to the process of making a decision that will bring about an action that will lead to a reward or a consequence. And we want them to think positively in all things. Let's see here. Rational thinking leads to decisions that are well thought out. Notice here, positive and moral. And remember what moral ties into. It ties into rules, following the rules. We covered that, not mistaken, on page 4 of this book here. Page 4 or 8. I'll just double check, give you the right page. 4, yes. 4, page 4, for your notes. All right. A lack of self-control, notice here, last paragraph on page 41. A lack of self-control can cause even a positive emotion to result in harm to yourself, others, or property. And that's what we just read with the example of the young man there who won the gift certificate for $100. And then he had, and then because of a lack of self-control, he had to actually take that winning and replace the vase that he knocked down. Even though it was an accident, he was still responsible for his actions. And then in the box down there it says, it is easier to practice self-control than to suffer the consequences of acting impulsively. And it, that statement's been used many different ways. It's, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure. It's easier to do the right thing than to have to fix the disaster that came from doing the wrong thing. It's easier to develop and maintain a positive character than it is to have to rebuild a negative character, right? And we'll find this out, and our students will find it out. A lot of us have found these things out in life, kind of like, remember we talked about maintaining a vehicle, maintaining your car, your character, maintaining your character is kind of like maintaining a car. You've got to, rotate the tires and keep the fluids fresh and clean and drained out. And, there's a certain amount of maintenance that you have to do to a car. And in a lot of manuals, they'll give you, intervals, maintenance intervals at so many thousand miles, you check this, so many thousand miles, you change this, and so forth. Well, it's the same with our character. And with our character, we have to reevaluate ourselves. We have to assess ourselves. We have to assess our values. We have to look at our principles and our morals, our way of thinking, and evaluate it and see if they're in line with the principles that we've been taught. And in maintaining those things, we have to make sure that we go back to the source, right? Because they tell you to use quality, genuine OEM parts, right, on your vehicle to keep them operating properly. Okay, well, we have to go back and rehearse these principles and keep them in the forefront of our minds so that we can operate properly in our thought processes that we have to engage in on a daily basis. But, in thinking about a car, if you say you get a brand new car, nice new car, and you've got that thing and you're so well pleased with it, right? And you wash it, you put premium gas. Well, you're probably not doing that today unless you're a millionaire, but you put the nicest gas in it, and you make sure that you use premium air in your tires. You guys know there's no premium air, right? Okay, I'm just making sure you guys are awake. Some people have been duped by that. They've been told that they need to get premium air. It's going to cost them a little bit more than the standard air, but you've got a nice car. This is the immorality in society that you find at some mechanic shops, and don't forget those radiator bearings and headlight lubricant. But you get a nice car and you take care of it and you wash it, but you drive it for 40,000 miles and you never change the oil. What do you think is going to occur when you take that thing into the dealer because your service engine light is on? That they're going to tell you, sir, looks like you need a new motor. Now a person who had a car and probably, were making payments or whatever on it, now they've got to come up with, who knows, $5,000 or $6,000 to replace the motor that it would have lasted them maybe 100, 150, 200,000 miles if they would have just taken the steps and the time to maintain it on a regular basis. So it's easier to maintain things than it is to have to go and collectively come up with a huge sum to fix it later, or have to try to work hard to rebuild your reputation after something that you did destroyed it, right? We're going to learn about that, or we've gone over that. One choice, a lifetime to build a positive reputation, it can be lost in one single act. All right, so on page 42, let's look over to page 42. So move forward here, because now we're going to talk about impulsive reactions. Impulsive reactions. We talked about responding, right? We want to make sure we respond properly. And now we're going to look at impulsive reactions. Remember, we covered the definition of impulsive, making decisions or acting without thinking about the consequences or without considering the consequences. Not acting without thinking, but acting without considering the consequences or the outcome of the decision that you're about to make. Well, on page 42 here, it says, a lack of self-control leads to irrational responses. An irrational response occurs when we act on emotion without gathering sufficient facts to make intelligent choices. Now, we just learned here on page 41 why it's important to gather facts so that you can make intelligent choices, right? And of course, in doing so, you are a rational person. I don't know if anybody's ever dealt with somebody who's irrational. And a lot of times they fall into this category of acting without self-control. They're screaming their head off. I can't, you're doing this or you're not doing this right or this or that, and they're just being completely irrational. They're not listening to reason. They're not listening to the facts, even though the facts might be sitting right smack dab in the middle of their face there. They're just so caught up on this particular emotion and how they feel that they're flying off the handle, right? And if you have the great honor to be in customer service, you're going to find yourself dealing with people like that occasionally. But notice here, they're not able to gather sufficient evidence or facts to make intelligent choices. Why? Because they're acting on emotions. They're acting on emotions without those things. Now, irrational behavior here, notice, is triggered. Remember, a trigger is something that starts a process by negative thoughts that cause feelings like jealousy, resentment, or rage. So that's a trigger. Now, a student who is educated in understanding, primary and secondary emotions and understanding triggers and so forth, they're going to stop and think about that, because they might go through this and quickly get to this jealousy, resentment, or rage, but they're going to stop and they're going to evaluate those thoughts and think about, what is it that got me to this point right here? Now I know what the right thing is to do. I know what the outcome is that I want, right? And what I don't want. I know what I don't want to get in a fight. I don't want to be suspended. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to have a bad reputation. Why am I feeling this way? All right. And just, it takes time, but they can assess their emotions. They can assess their thoughts and reevaluate them, and then focus on the opposite. Focus on a positive thought, right? Which, of course, will start the process of triggering positive emotions. And then that'll give them the opportunity with a clear mind, not a clouded mind, right, to be able to gather these facts and then make a sensible choice. Anyone who responds irrationally to a situation is not using self-control. Remember, we cannot do just anything we want to do. And society has rules in place to guard that, right? We cannot do just anything we want to do. Now, a lot of young people, because they're somewhat sheltered to some degree, at home, they don't have to go out and work and drive, and there's rules of conduct at work and so forth. I mean, they do have that at school, but the older you get and the greater the responsibilities, seeming the more the serious the consequences that come when you break those rules, right? You break the speed limit, you drink and drive, you steal from work, there's some serious consequences that come with that, as opposed to somebody taking someone's pencil at school, right? There's consequences with that too, but the older you get, the more society expects of you. Now, society expects a lot of adults, but sadly, there's not a lot put into adults or children to help them to become great adults, right? We focus on certain things that that focus on, building wealth, but not the things that build the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of a positive character that will enable them to really contribute beneficially, to society. Remember, we cannot do just anything we want to do. We must always be willing to stop and consider what we are thinking, how we are feeling, and then use self-control to make a choice that is positive and moral. Okay? And again, like I mentioned before, it takes time, right? It takes time to, not every decision is an instant automatic decision. Over a period of time, it will become easier to distinguish certain things, and you can make a quicker decision than with others, but sometimes, you might really have to stop and think about it. I wanted to read this because, we're not really separating these really too much here, because we talk about impulsive reactions, but irrational responses and so forth. But sometimes in the world of psychology, they sometimes will differentiate responses from reactions. I don't know if you've ever had anybody ever had an allergic reaction to something. I remember going to the doctor when I was younger, because you had to have checkups to go to schools and things like that, and do certain things, and they would give you allergy test, right? And they would give you a little scratch or something like that on your arm with different things that were allergens, and to test how your body would react to it, right? And it would swell or make a bump, or it would do nothing, depending on the degree of your resistance to certain things. Well, our bodies tend to react to certain things in our environment, or stimuli in our environment, stimulus in our environment, and so forth. We do this as well emotionally when we're triggered by certain things. But a person who is using the principles that we're taught here in the peaceful solution, they're going to take a little time to stop and think about the proper response to give, right? When someone's giving an interview, in a press conference, and someone, questions them with a difficult question, right? They can react and say, "You know what? That's just a stupid question. Why would you even come here and ask me that?" Or they can stop and think and respond peacefully, right? Or diplomatically. And that's what our diplomats are supposed to do. They're supposed to give responses that aren't offensive to anyone else, but also helps to bring about the objective that they're sent there to bring about. Well, this is from Psychology Today, and it says here, a reaction, and this is the generalized, a reaction is generally instant. It is driven by the beliefs, biases, and prejudices of the, they have here, unconscious mind or subconscious mind. When you say or do something without thinking, which we know we always are thinking, we're always thinking about things, right? Thoughts enter into our minds at the speed of light. Thousands of thoughts a day, maybe hundreds of thousands of thoughts a day, thousands of decisions that are being made a day, that are taking place in our lives. It says the subconscious mind is running the show. A reaction is based on in the moment and doesn't take into consideration long-term effects of what you are doing or saying, what you're going to do or say. And that's what we're talking about, irrational decisions, right? Impulsive, irrational decisions, impulsive reactions, not taking into consideration, right, the long-term effects or even the short-term effects of what you do or say. Sometimes a reaction is survival-oriented and on some level a defense mechanism, just like people will kind of puff up when they feel like the person is accusing them of something. We're going to get into that. We covered a little bit of that before, but, about jumping to conclusions and so forth. They get defensive instead of getting the facts and actually hearing the question that's being asked. It might turn out okay, but often the reaction is something you regret later. And that's what we're talking about here in making decisions without getting the facts. Now it says here, a response, on the other hand, usually comes more slowly, is based on information from both the conscious and unconscious mind. A response will be more, they have here, ecologically, meaning that it takes into consideration the well-being of not only those around you, not only you, excuse me, but those around you. And of course, the peaceful solution says a decision is one that doesn't hurt yourself, others, or the environment. And they use the generalized term ecologically, what's in your environment or ecosystem. It weighs the long-term effects and stays in line with your core values. And of course, our core values should be, based on these moral principles that we're finding here in the peaceful solution. And that's kind of how society looks at responses versus reactions. But generally speaking, we should always, anything that comes from us, whether our words, we have to even take into consideration our facial expressions, our tone of voice, and so forth. What we do, they should be governed by the moral principles that we're learning here, the rules that enable us to have healthy, positive interactions with others and our environment. All right, so let's look at this last section here. Yeah. Irrational behavior can lead to hurt feelings and loss of friendships. And then we have a scenario here. It says, Cindy scored higher on the math test than Karen did, even though Karen studied for hours. Karen, notice here, felt jealous and resentful that Cindy received a better grade than she did. Karen gave Cindy the cold shoulder for the rest of the day. Not knowing why Karen was upset, Cindy felt hurt by the way Karen treated her. And then you see there in the little box there, I got an A and I didn't even study, So Cindy or Karen felt really bad about, Karen was upset about that because she put forth a lot of effort. And then it gives the example here, or the think about it section here, that you will go over this with your students, to kind of get their thoughts on it and to help them understand the scenario and see how these things come about. Number one here, the first question is, what triggered or what negative thoughts do you think triggered Karen's feelings of jealousy and resentment? Of course, answers might vary from your students, but generally you're looking for Karen could have thought that it wasn't fair that she studied and didn't get a passing grade. She might have also thought that her friend was showing off, right? And these are some of the things that might have been going through Karen's mind, but things that you kind of want to get, kind of pick the brain and the thought process of your students. And then the second question there is, what could Karen have thought about Cindy's grades that would have prevented her irrational behavior? And some of the answers might be Karen could have been glad that Cindy did well. She could have considered asking Cindy to tutor her so that she could pass the next test. And that's just an example of how, irrational behavior could lead to hurt feelings or a loss of friendships. Or, she could turn it around and not think so negatively about the situation and realize, Cindy might not have been, showing off. She just might have just been excited. She got a great grade, right? And what could Karen do next time to maybe improve her situation? So there's, both scenarios there, both sides of the coin, both positive and negative examples there. And so these are the things that we want to kind of drill into our students' minds and understanding about their emotions, and not just their emotions. They need to recognize those things, but also how they should respond. Recognize they might have this impulsive, defensive, response when they feel like they're being aggressively approached. But remind them, they've got to stop, think, consider their options, and then proceed with the right choice. So we're going to stop there on page 42 and get ready for the next class here, which is going to be Sunday, the 27th. And that'll be, I believe, David will be our next teacher there. And it'll be at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you then. Have a great evening.